So, the new Last of Us show came out, and it's all the good things you've heard about it. It's a groundbreaking work of art that will forever change the way society views the adaptation. Or at least I think it still is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm still supposed to like it. I think. Sorry, I know this isn't the show's fault, but as someone familiar with the source material, it's just kind of hard for me to get excited about these one-to-one adaptations where scenes are oftentimes directly copy and pasted line for line, shot for shot. And again, this might just be me projecting, but it kind of seems like because of this, week after week, episode after episode, the show got more and more bored of itself. And I really am sorry because I feel like that statement will come across as incredibly reductive and disrespectful to all of the immensely talented people who clearly poured their heart and soul into the project, but I can't think of any other way to describe it. Because it's not like the show gets bad, and it's not like the show gets boring either. But something is missing. Somewhere along the way, the experience that once felt like an active one became passive, and I've been really trying to figure out how something like this happens. But then I realized that it might have something to do with the fact that the story of The Last of Us was an active experience that got twisted and contorted to fit a very specific mold. And I should clarify that this doesn't ruin the show or automatically invalidate it either, but it is a problem that I can really only see getting worse as the show moves into its second season. So no, this isn't a video where I rattle off a list of grievances just to wrap it all up by saying it has a little something for everyone. Just try to think about the idea of artistic intent and how dragging the story across mediums and expecting nothing to fundamentally change it was maybe a little short-sighted. Just maybe. Honestly, I don't even know why I'm playing Damage Control right now. This video's comment section is basically guaranteed to be a complete shit show, so after all is said and done, I'm just hoping I have the strength to sift through the paragraphs and paragraphs of fucking wingdings. Wish me luck. So, stories in video games, right? They are almost always shit. Like, notoriously so. Like, 9 times out of 10, they are not even worth engaging with because of how bogged down they become with really trite commentary about violence in media. And maybe, if they're feeling particularly spicy, they'll throw in some horseshit about player agency. Either that, or they simply don't take full advantage of the medium of games to tell their story, resulting in an experience that lacks a strong identity. And for the longest time, I kinda lumped The Last of Us in with that second description. Obviously, it's a lesser offender considering the game's story is actually good, but nothing about it really screamed this needs to be a video game and only a video game. In fact, for years, maybe the most popular criticism towards The Last of Us was, why isn't this just a movie? Why isn't this just a show? I wish I could get this exact experience, just slightly different. And the monkey's paw curled. Alright, I'm being a little bit dramatic, but just hear me out. I mentioned earlier that it feels like the show gets bored of itself. That's only half true. It's more like the show realized the connective tissue of gameplay was a lot more necessary than I think anyone ever really gave it credit for. So as I'm watching, everything feels rushed, from the development of our leads to the actual events in the story. Joel and Ellie hardly have a chance to breathe because the narrative is constantly pushing them towards a set destination in a way that's unnatural. It feels less like a show to me and more like a compilation of all the game's cutscenes. All of it's serviceable, but not super exceptional because of how limited the creators obviously felt working within the confines of the adaptation. And anything that is changed, no matter how much it may or may not have made me cry, is ultimately inconsequential. However, I am aware that I have thought about this more than any human should, and it's really not that big of a deal. Honestly, it's pretty hard to fuck up a story with a foundation as strong as The Last of Us, so I guess it's a good thing that there's not an infinitely more complex sequel on the horizon where almost none of this applies. Part 2 is, interesting because of how much of the game hinges on this idea of subversion. Oh, what's that? You thought this was how The Last of Us sequel was gonna play out? Well, we just blew up the horse. Go fuck yourself. But it's a pretty admirable sentiment to shape the highly anticipated follow-up around, or at least it would have been if not for the fact that months before its release, virtually every aspect of the game's story was spoiled. Now, normally this is not the kind of thing that I would even care to mention, but the shadow it cast over Part 2's release is simply too large to ignore. It completely changed the way the game was initially received. The damage had already been done. The discourse stopped being, well, despite some flaws, the game does some pretty revolutionary stuff in regards to toying around with the conventional structure in games, and instead, the headlines read, Joel dies via golf club, we'll be back to the weather at 6. Which is a shame, because in some alternate world where this particular leak never sprung, I genuinely believed that The Last of Us Part 2 would be heralded as some sort of minor masterpiece. But while I respect Part 2 for being really unique, I wouldn't really be doing my job as a critic if I didn't at least try to pick at some of the game's scabs. So, because of the insane amount of context that even breathing in this game's direction requires, I must now become the one thing I've always feared I would. Spark notes. I feel like too much emphasis is placed on whether or not Joel's decision at the end of the first game was morally correct. It's an inherently selfish choice, sure, but we have no reason to believe a cure is truly a viable option. Nothing in The Last of Us is that simple. Nearly everything in this world operates in this gray area. But the fact is, Joel already lost one daughter, he isn't going to lose another. It's what makes this moment feel natural, just another obstacle in his way. However, retconning this guy to be really important and a super chill dude, actually, considering he's one of the only nameless squishies you must pull the trigger on, feels, what's the opposite of natural? Anyway, in the most broad strokes terms, part 2 is about Ellie going on a nationwide murder spree, and on the way, she eventually learns to accept and forgive Joel for the decision he made that she had no say in. It's honestly a pretty smart way of doing the arc that everyone expected out of these two, but the game is far too ambitious to call it quits there, so right at the culmination of everything, the game practically resets and you play as Abby, daughter of fucking goddammit, who goes on her own Last of Us themed adventure and learns what it's like to be at the receiving end of the figurative golf club. They're meant to complement each other. It's the whole you and I aren't so different Spider-Man approach, and for the most part I think it works, but what is it about adapting the story that changes that? Well, a lot of the emotional weight of part 2 is dependent on you giving at least a little bit of a shit about Abby, and I know it's pretty hotly contested on whether or not the game actually succeeds in terms of winning you over, but that's kind of my point. It's asking a lot of your audience to empathize with a character who will always be defined as the one who killed Joel, so establishing a connection with Abby through gameplay is more important than ever. What can I say? Something about me pressing the funny button, making her do a move, activates something in my monkey brain, and if you've made it this far, I'd be willing to bet you've suffered some sort of similar psychosis. Not to mention, the game's revolutionary status in terms of its storytelling as a video game doesn't really translate to film. Basically, the games are just generally better at making you care, and additionally, there are tons of both thematic through lines and little details that are just completely lost through adaptation. Unlike the original Last of Us, Part 2 is a game's game. It doesn't make sense to me as anything else, and it looks like the big brains over at HBO must agree considering the truly fucking crazy town banana pants decision making going on in regards to the show's second and possibly third seasons. First of all, I can't even begin to imagine where you would split Part 2's story in a way that would be at all satisfying, but whatever. The bigger thing is that they're playing around with this idea of changing major events in the narrative and just no. I'm sure it would smooth some things over in terms of minimizing the amount of anthrax into HBO HQ, but no. Obviously, not all changes are bad ones, but if this statement means what I think it does, that only goes to show a complete lack of faith in the source material, and what is even the fucking point in adapting something that you inherently don't respect? You know, aside from milking every last second out of your Pedro Pascal, and honestly, fair enough. But I feel like my points are getting a bit messy, so let me try to put as neat of a bow as possible on this thing. Earlier, when I mentioned Part 2's initial reception, I wasn't doing that just to be cute. I brought it up to highlight how it reminds me of my relationship to the show. Because I went in with knowledge of the games, I have been forever robbed of the experience that I think was intended. And again, this isn't the show's fault, but it isn't not the show's fault either. There is a way to keep things fresh while staying true to the feel of the franchise, but it isn't done by constantly begging your viewers to make these kinds of comparisons. It is possible for an adaptation to have its own identity. Look, at the end of the day, all I'm asking for is some kind of relationship between creatives and their audiences where they aren't scared to challenge each other, so if you'll excuse me, I'm going to spend the next 72 hours in hiding out of fear of strangers online, because I've seen what a golf club can do. No, but like, look, right? The real reason The Last of Us show isn't as good as the game is because Joel doesn't go,
he ain't even hurt.